I don't care who you are. You don't just steal a car in front of me. Sheriff Jack O'Reilly barked as he marched toward the woman standing by the SUV at the gas station. His voice boomed through the still night air, cutting through the hum of the station lights and the distant sound of cars passing on the highway. The woman, her back straight, her expression calm, didn't flinch. She stood there, seemingly unfazed by his aggressive approach. Her eyes never left his, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She knew exactly how this would play out. But Sheriff O'Reilly didn't. He only saw a black woman in a nice car at a gas station late at night. And in his mind, that was all the evidence he needed. I'm talking to you, he snapped again, getting closer. Still, the woman didn't respond. He could see the tension building in the air around them, the subtle shift in her posture, but she remained composed, controlled. You think you can just walk around here like you own the place? He continued, his voice rising. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but the pride he took in it was already starting to feel hollow. The woman's silence only seemed to infuriate him more. He was used to getting a reaction, to being in control. But this time, there was something different. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. I'm Sheriff Jack O'Reilly, and I don't take kindly to criminals, especially not ones like you. He pulled out his phone, ready to call for backup, already planning the report he would file. But as he moved, the woman's calm voice interrupted him. You're making a mistake, she said quietly, her words almost a whisper in the cool night. I didn't steal anything. Sheriff O'Reilly stopped in his tracks, confused by her tone. Most people would have been defensive by now, pleading their innocence, but not her. She simply stood there, steady and unwavering. You're wasting your time, she added, her gaze unwavering. I'm FBI Special Agent Tasha Williams. The words hit Sheriff O'Reilly like a slap in the face, and for a moment, he froze. He looked her up and down, trying to make sense of what she was saying. FBI, he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. You? No way. But the woman, Agent Tasha Williams, pulled out her badge, flashing it in front of him. The weight of her words, the power behind them, shifted the atmosphere around them. The sound of the gas station, the distant cars, all faded as the reality of the situation set in. Sheriff O'Reilly's face flushed. His mind raced. He had made a huge mistake. But it wasn't just any mistake. It was one that would cost him everything. Tasha didn't move, didn't blink. She just waited, letting the silence hang between them like a heavy fog. And when she spoke again, it wasn't with anger, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. You should have thought twice before accusing me. Now, I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you really are. The moment Tasha flashed her FBI badge, the silence between them was almost unbearable. Sheriff Jack O'Reilly stood frozen, his hand still gripping the phone in his pocket, as if trying to process what just happened. He had always prided himself on his instincts, on his ability to handle any situation. But this was something entirely different. His gaze flickered between the badge and Tasha's calm face, trying to make sense of the situation. FBI? No. This doesn't make sense, he muttered to himself, his mind racing. Tasha stood there, her posture unwavering, her expression as steady as ever. She didn't rush to explain herself. There was no need. She knew Sheriff O'Reilly was already in a tailspin, and it would be only a matter of time before the truth sunk in. As the seconds ticked by, Tasha's calmness seemed to ripple outward, filling the empty space between them. She wasn't just an agent. She was a force to be reckoned with. She was exactly where she needed to be. The tension in the air was thick, but Tasha didn't flinch. She simply held her ground. You're going to regret this, she said, her voice a soft, controlled warning that carried more weight than anything he could say in return. Sheriff O'Reilly's mind was spinning. He was a man of authority, used to controlling situations, but now it felt as though everything he had known about power was slipping through his fingers. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw clenched as the realization began to settle in. He had made a mistake, a huge mistake. But what could he do now? His reputation, his career, everything was on the line. I'm sorry, he stammered, trying to salvage some shred of control. But Tasha didn't acknowledge his apology. Instead, she reached for her radio, speaking calmly into the device. This is Agent Williams. I need backup. Her voice was smooth, professional, yet there was an underlying steel to it that made it impossible to ignore. O'Reilly's mind raced. How could he have missed the signs? He should have known better. He had seen her standing there, too calm, too composed, but his biases had clouded his judgment. Now, he was paying the price. As Tasha waited for backup, she turned her gaze back to the gas station. She knew the wheels were already in motion. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. As she stood there, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Sheriff O'Reilly was going to be exposed for what he was, a racist cop who had acted out of bias and ignorance. He had crossed the line, and now, it was her turn to make sure he was held accountable. But Tasha wasn't interested in revenge. She wasn't driven by anger or a desire to humiliate him. What mattered now was justice, and she was going to make sure that he was held accountable for his actions. As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, Sheriff O'Reilly's face went pale. The weight of what he had just done was finally sinking in. He had accused the wrong person, and now he was about to face the consequences. The sirens grew louder, and Tasha took one last look at O'Reilly, her expression still calm, still controlled. She was a woman of action, not words. And as the backup arrived, she knew that this was only the beginning of the battle. The real work was just getting started. "I don't know how this happened," Sheriff O'Reilly muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, his hands shaking as he stood in front of the police car, waiting for the backup to arrive. The sound of sirens grew louder, and the pressure in his chest increased with every passing second. Tasha Williams stood by the SUV, her posture unchanged, her eyes scanning the scene with a cool precision that made it clear she had been in situations like this before. She had seen this before, the arrogance, the biases, and the sudden realization that power can be taken away in an instant. The backup arrived, a pair of officers stepping out of their squad car with their eyes locked on O'Reilly. Tasha didn't need to say a word. She simply nodded toward the sheriff, her eyes still focused on him as if daring him to speak. The officers approached, their steps deliberate. O'Reilly's face flushed, a mix of fear and humiliation creeping up his neck. He tried to compose himself, but his mind was a mess of confusion. This can't be happening," he said under his breath, but it was too late. The moment he had crossed that line, it was over. The officers looked to Tasha for direction. She turned to them with the calm authority that came naturally to someone who had spent years working undercover, navigating a world that often didn't want to hear the truth. "Take him in," she said simply. Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of someone who had already made up her mind about what needed to happen. The officers didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, efficiently, as Tasha stepped aside to allow them to do their job. As they took O'Reilly's cuffs off and led him toward their car, Tasha couldn't help but notice how much he shrank under their gaze. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of his own actions was suddenly too much to bear. He was no longer the proud sheriff who had walked up to her with so much arrogance just moments ago. Now, he was just another man caught in his own web of lies. As the officers drove away with O'Reilly, Tasha remained standing by the SUV, her arms crossed in front of her. The cool night air did nothing to ease the storm brewing inside her. This wasn't about O'Reilly anymore. It wasn't about the false accusations he had made or the way he had treated her. It was about the system. A system that protected people like him and let them get away with this kind of behavior. For too long, the world had turned a blind eye to the actions of people in power, people like O'Reilly. But today that was changing. Tasha had made sure of it. She took a deep breath, allowing the cool air to fill her lungs. This was just the beginning. She knew that O'Reilly's arrest wouldn't be the end of the story. There were others out there, others who thought they could get away with similar actions. But now, with O'Reilly in custody, it was time to start digging deeper. Tasha turned and walked toward her car, her mind already shifting to the next steps. This case wasn't over. It was only just beginning. "I'm not sure how to fix this," Sheriff O'Reilly muttered, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and disbelief. He sat in the back of the squad car, his hands cuffed tightly behind him, the cold metal biting into his wrists. Outside, the lights of the gas station faded into the distance as the car sped toward the station. O'Reilly's mind raced, replaying the moment when everything had gone wrong. He had been so sure, so convinced that he was in control. But now, as the reality of the situation sank in, he realized he had been wrong. He was no longer the sheriff. He was just another man facing the consequences of his own actions. The car drove through the streets, the hum of the engine and the occasional passing car the only sounds in the quiet night. Sheriff O'Reilly tried to focus, but his mind kept returning to Tasha Williams. She had stood there, so calm, so composed, while he had tried to bully her into submission. She hadn't reacted the way anyone else would have. She hadn't yelled, hadn't gotten defensive. She had simply stood there, revealing her true identity and flipping everything he thought he knew upside down. She had to have known I was a cop, O'Reilly thought to himself. She had to have known I wouldn't just let her walk away. But he had underestimated her. Tasha wasn't just an FBI agent. She was someone who knew exactly how to handle people like him. As the car continued down the road, O'Reilly's thoughts turned to his career. He had worked his way up the ranks, built a reputation, earned respect. Or so he had thought. He had spent his life thinking that his badge would protect him, that it would give him the power to control situations, to make people listen. But now, it had failed him. He had misused that power, abused it, and now he was paying the price. I shouldn't have let this happen, O'Reilly muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. He couldn't believe how easily things had slipped out of his grasp. A few moments ago, he had been in charge, a lawman with the power to enforce justice. Now, he was the one being arrested, the one being led away in disgrace. It was a sobering realization, and one that weighed heavily on his chest. Meanwhile, Tasha stood at the scene, her arms crossed as she watched the squad car disappear into the distance. She felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with moments like this, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of calm. This wasn't about her. It wasn't about proving a point or getting revenge. This was about something much bigger, a system that allowed people like O'Reilly to thrive and abuse their power without fear of consequence. As she walked back to her car, Tasha's thoughts shifted to the next steps. This was just the beginning of the investigation. Sheriff O'Reilly was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. There were other officers out there, other people who thought they could get away with their actions. And Tasha was going to make sure they were all held accountable. She had spent years working undercover, gathering information, building cases, and now it was time to bring it all to light. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Tasha knew that it was the only path to justice. The system was broken, but she was determined to fix it, piece by piece. As she sat in her car, the engine humming softly, Tasha's mind was already working, already planning her next move. She had seen the flaws in the system before, but now, she was going to expose them. And Sheriff O'Reilly was just the first domino to fall. As Tasha sat in her car, watching the lights of the police station in the distance, she knew the hardest part was just beginning. The case against Sheriff O'Reilly was a small but crucial victory, one that would send ripples through the system, but it was only a first step. Tasha had seen how quickly things could unravel when powerful people started to feel the heat. She couldn't let this moment slip away. She needed to keep the pressure on, to make sure the system that allowed O'Reilly to operate with impunity was held accountable. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a message from her partner, Daniel. The investigation's about to take a turn. We've got something big, it read. Tasha's eyes narrowed as she read the message. She had known this case was bigger than just O'Reilly, but now, it seemed like the pieces were falling into place faster than she had anticipated. She started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, her mind already turning over the possibilities. As she drove toward the office, Tasha's thoughts shifted to the investigation. O'Reilly was just one cog in a much larger machine. He had been brazen, yes, but he wasn't the only one. He wasn't even the worst of them. There were other officers, other figures in law enforcement, who had used their power to target and abuse people for far too long. Some were careful, some were more subtle, but all of them needed to be exposed. The problem wasn't just O'Reilly's racism or his disregard for the law. It was the system that allowed people like him to thrive. It was a system that protected those in power, that turned a blind eye to their wrongdoings, and that made it nearly impossible for people like Tasha to do their jobs without facing endless obstacles. She knew what she was up against. She had worked in this field long enough to understand the weight of the task ahead. But Tasha had never been one to back down. The truth was on her side, and she was determined to make sure it came to light, no matter the cost. As she pulled into the parking lot, Tasha parked and got out of the car, her boots clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the office. She took a deep breath before entering. Inside, Daniel was waiting for her, a stack of files in front of him. "You're going to want to see this," he said, his voice low but urgent. He handed her a file, and Tasha opened it. The papers inside were filled with details, investigative reports, surveillance footage, and testimonies that painted a chilling picture. This wasn't just about O'Reilly. It was about a network, a corrupt system that stretched far beyond one sheriff. Tasha's eyes scanned the documents quickly, her heart racing as she pieced the puzzle together. "This goes deeper than we thought," she said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. Daniel nodded. "We've got enough to go public with this. But it's going to take time. We'll need to be careful. There are people with a lot to lose here." Tasha nodded. She knew the risks. But this was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The moment when everything she had worked for would finally pay off. "We start tomorrow," she said, closing the file. The time for waiting was over. Now it was time for action. Tasha stood in the quiet of the office, the weight of the files in her hands heavier than ever. The documents were spread out before her, a map of corruption and deceit stretching back years. The faces of those involved were buried within the pages, names that once seemed untouchable. Now, they were all connected by the strings of a system that had failed the people it was meant to protect. She exhaled slowly, her mind racing as she processed the magnitude of what she was holding. This wasn't just a few bad apples in law enforcement. This was a network, a machine built to keep the status quo intact no matter the cost. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Daniel. "We're ready to move forward. Time to take it to the press." Tasha glanced at the clock. It was late, but this was the moment they had been preparing for. This was the moment everything would change. She had spent countless hours gathering evidence, working quietly behind the scenes, making sure every piece of the puzzle fit perfectly. And now, it was time to expose the truth. The system that had allowed Sheriff O'Reilly and countless others like him to operate with impunity was about to come crashing down. She stood up from her desk, the weight of the decision still lingering in the air around her. There was no turning back now. Tasha grabbed her coat and walked toward the door. "Let's do this," she whispered to herself. Outside, the night was cool, the streets empty save for a few passing cars. She felt a calm resolve settle over her. The hard part was done. Now, it was just a matter of making sure the world knew what had been happening. As she stepped into the elevator and made her way to the parking garage, her mind wandered back to the moment when everything had started, the day she had first realized how deep the corruption ran. The case had seemed simple at first, just another routine investigation into a police officer accused of misconduct. But as she dug deeper, Tasha had uncovered a system of protection that went far beyond one bad cop. It was an entire network of officers, judges, and politicians working together to ensure that the truth was buried. Sheriff O'Reilly had been the first to crack, but he was only a small piece of the puzzle. The real challenge was going to be taking down the rest of them. She had no illusions about what was at stake. This wasn't just about bringing justice to one sheriff. This was about dismantling a system that had failed for far too long. Tasha drove through the quiet streets, her car humming along the road. She was focused, determined, but there was a part of her that couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Exposing the corruption was only the beginning. The fallout would be massive, and the people behind it would fight back in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. As she pulled into the parking lot of the press office, Tasha took a deep breath. She knew the risks, but she also knew that the truth had a way of getting out, no matter how hard people tried to keep it hidden. She walked into the building, her steps echoing in the empty hallway. Daniel was already waiting for her, standing by the conference room door. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady. Tasha nodded, the determination in her eyes unwavering. "Let's bring this down," she said. Together, they stepped into the room, the weight of the moment settling around them. Tasha took her seat, her fingers resting on the papers in front of her. She was about to reveal the truth to the world, and she wouldn't let anything stand in her way. Tasha sat at the conference table, her fingers lightly tapping the papers in front of her. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft shuffle of pages being turned by Daniel, who sat beside her. The weight of the moment was almost tangible. The truth was about to be set free, and with it, the potential for a ripple effect that could change everything. The journalists were already gathering in the room, their notepads open, their eyes scanning the quiet tension that filled the space. This wasn't just another press conference. This was the moment that would expose the corruption that had been festering for far too long. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice calm, but carrying a hint of the urgency that they both felt. Tasha nodded. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for every question, every challenge that might come her way. But even with all the preparation, she knew the weight of what she was about to say. This was more than just an investigation. It was a declaration. The door opened, and the journalists filed in, each one taking their seat, eyes on Tasha and Daniel. The room buzzed with whispered questions, anticipation building. The silence grew thick as the last of the seats were filled. Tasha took a deep breath, her mind sharp, focused. She had always known that exposing corruption wasn't going to be easy. It would be messy. It would be difficult. But it was necessary. As she stood up and walked to the podium, every eye in the room followed her. Tasha adjusted the microphone, her hands steady as she cleared her throat. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice clear, strong, but calm. "I stand before you today to reveal something that has been hidden from the public for far too long. For years, a network of individuals within law enforcement has been abusing their power, manipulating the system, and hurting those they were supposed to protect. Today, that network is being exposed." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the air. The room was silent, the journalists scribbling down every word. "I am Agent Tasha Williams of the FBI, and I have been working on a case that has uncovered widespread corruption within law enforcement. It's a corruption that has allowed officers, judges, and other officials to operate without fear of accountability. They have used their positions to silence victims, to manipulate the justice system, and to protect each other at the expense of the very people they are meant to serve." Tasha took a moment to glance at the reporters in front of her. She could feel their eyes on her, their questions hanging in the air, waiting for more. "This investigation began with one man, Sheriff O'Reilly," she continued, her voice steady. "But it doesn't end with him. O'Reilly is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. This is a system that has been protecting the corrupt, enabling the unjust, and silencing the voices of those who need it the most." She paused again, letting her words hang in the air. The journalists were silent, absorbing the gravity of what she was saying. "Today, I'm not just exposing one man. I'm exposing a system that has failed. A system that has allowed racism, abuse of power, and corruption to thrive unchecked. And I'm here to ensure that those responsible are held accountable." Tasha's eyes swept across the room, meeting the gaze of each reporter. "This is just the beginning. We will continue to investigate, continue to expose the truth, and continue to fight for justice. The days of protecting the corrupt are over." With that, she stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was still, the silence deafening. Then, the questions began. "Agent Williams, can you tell us more about the other individuals involved? How far does this corruption go? What steps are being taken to ensure those responsible face consequences?" Tasha answered each question with the same calm determination. She was ready for this. She had prepared for it. And now, the world was about to hear the truth. As the press conference ended, Tasha felt a wave of relief wash over her. The truth was out. The battle wasn't over, but it had begun. And this time, there was no turning back. Tasha sat back in her chair, the weight of the press conference still hanging over her. The questions had come fast, but she had been prepared. She had known that the moment the truth was revealed, the fallout would begin. What she hadn't expected, though, was the speed at which everything had started to shift. News outlets across the country were picking up the story, and already, the first signs of change were becoming apparent. Her phone buzzed with notifications, the sound constant, and as she checked each one, her heart began to race. The public was reacting, the shockwaves were spreading. People were angry, but they were also demanding action. She had done what she set out to do, expose the corruption, give the victims a voice, and finally start the process of dismantling the system. But now, the hard work really began. Tasha stood up, pacing the small office, her mind working quickly. She had seen the coverage, the outrage, and the calls for justice. But the real battle, the one that would require all her focus and determination, had only just begun. It was one thing to expose the corruption. It was another to make sure it was rooted out, that the system was not allowed to simply sweep it under the rug. She couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything that had come to light. The investigation was far from over. There were still so many pieces to uncover, so many individuals who were involved, who had turned a blind eye, or who had been complicit in the abuse of power. Sheriff O'Reilly was just the start. There was a whole web of corruption waiting to be exposed, and Tasha was determined to follow every lead, to leave no stone unturned. As she stood there, her thoughts swirling, Daniel entered the room. He looked serious, his face set in a way that told her something had changed. "We've got a situation," he said quietly, his voice low. Tasha looked at him, her pulse quickening. "What's happened?" Daniel walked over and handed her a stack of papers. "We've been getting some calls. It seems like some of the people involved are starting to panic. We've got a leak." Tasha frowned, scanning the pages. The names and details in front of her were a list of people she had hoped wouldn't be caught in the crossfire. But now, it seemed that the corruption was deeper than she had realized. Some of the individuals involved were trying to cover their tracks, using their positions to shield themselves. Tasha set the papers down, her mind already racing. "We need to move fast. We can't let them clean up after themselves. We have to find out who's behind this leak before they can get to the information we've gathered." Daniel nodded. "I'm on it," he said, his voice firm. "We need to stay ahead of this." As Daniel left the room to handle the situation, Tasha sat down at her desk, taking a deep breath. The pressure was mounting, but she knew what had to be done. She had to keep the momentum going, had to push forward. There were people counting on her, and she wouldn't let them down. The corruption that had been allowed to thrive for so long was finally being exposed, and she wasn't going to stop until every last bit of it was brought into the light. Tasha turned back to the files on her desk. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose. The truth was out, and no matter how hard they tried to bury it, she was going to make sure it stayed in the spotlight. She picked up the phone and dialed a number, her voice steady as she spoke to the investigator on the other end. "We need to follow up on the leads. Every single one. No one is getting away with this." She hung up, knowing that the real fight was just beginning. But she was ready. She had always been ready. Tasha's mind was racing as she stepped into the conference room, papers and files scattered across the table in front of her. The news had spread like wildfire, but now the real work had begun. The leaks were becoming more frequent, and with every one that came through, it became clearer that the web of corruption was even larger than she'd imagined. The information she had been gathering, painstakingly collected over the course of months, was being targeted. If they couldn't control the narrative, they would try to destroy it. "We need to get ahead of this," Tasha said, looking over at Daniel as he entered the room with another stack of documents. He nodded, his face tight with concern. "The leaks are coming from high up. It's not just random names now, it's strategy." Tasha leaned forward, her fingers resting on the edge of the table. "Do we know who's behind it?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet, but we have a few leads. One of them seems to be an insider in the department. We're narrowing it down, but it's going to take some time." Tasha stared at the papers before her, her mind sifting through the information she had. Time was something they didn't have. With every passing moment, the risk of losing control over the investigation grew. They had to act now. "We can't afford to wait," Tasha said, her voice steady, but with an edge of urgency. "We need to move quickly and cover our tracks better. This isn't just about exposing the corruption anymore. This is about making sure it sticks." Daniel gave her a sharp look. "What are you thinking?" Tasha paused, considering her next steps. "We need to get the press involved again. If they think we're backing down or losing control, they'll smell blood in the water. We need to keep the pressure on. We reveal what we have, but we do it strategically." She glanced out the window, the city skyline stretching before her. "Let's make sure they know this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Over the next few days, Tasha and her team worked tirelessly to uncover the leak. Every conversation was scrutinized, every piece of evidence re-examined. It wasn't easy. There were obstacles at every turn. Some of the people they had trusted had disappeared, others had stopped answering their calls. But Tasha knew they couldn't back down. She had made a promise to herself and to the victims of the system that she would see this through. On the third day after the leaks began, Tasha received a call. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't expected. "I've got something you're going to want to see," the voice said, familiar but distant. "Meet me at the usual place." Tasha didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door, her mind running through possibilities. This could be the breakthrough they needed, or it could be another dead end. But she had to go. As she drove to the meeting spot, her thoughts were a blur of faces and names. The deeper they dug, the more they found, each discovery leading to another layer of deception. But if this lead panned out, it could be the turning point. She pulled up to the parking lot and parked her car. The familiar face was already waiting, standing under the dim light of a street lamp. Tasha stepped out of the car and walked over. "What have you got?" she asked. The person handed her a folder. "This is what you've been looking for," they said. Tasha opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. What she found wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was the key. A chain of emails, documents, and phone records that connected the highest levels of law enforcement to the corruption they had been investigating. This was bigger than she thought. This was the smoking gun. Tasha's hands shook slightly as she closed the folder, her mind already working. They had everything they needed. Now, they just had to make sure the right people saw it. "This is it," she whispered, almost to herself. "This is where it all ends." But even as she spoke those words, Tasha knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Exposing the truth was one thing. Holding everyone accountable was another. And she wasn't done yet. The battle for justice was only beginning.